Some of you already know that I've got this weird obsession with trying to capture energy from tidal flow from Port Phillip Heads, and in this particular model, I've modelled up the bay, which is about 20 cubic kilometres. This is just south of Melbourne, and on one side we've got Mornington Peninsula, we've got the Bellarine Peninsula on the other side, so between Queenscliff and Portsea. And instead of your typical submerged turbine-style underwater power generator, I looked at this system where it's a series of effectively parachutes. And they're not affected by all sorts of weird turbulences and things that happen underwater. So the parachute gets connected to a big long line around a winch, and the winch is connected to the to an alternator or a generator. And the parachutes pull these lines out very slowly with great torque, huge amount of torque, and it's a seesawing kind of action. It's a reciprocating action. So it gets drawn out, it gets pulled back in, gets drawn out, it gets pulled back in, and that's what turns the generators around. It's not a great system by any means, but it's an interesting one, and it means the entire system can be built above the water. So here it is. So here's the parachute, and it's a two-line system. So the parachute is when it's got the flow of water against it, it balloons out like this, and gets drawn away from the winch, and the winch is then turning the generator. Huge amount of torque, a massive amount of torque on this parachute. So you can see these lines that go through the middle of it. And it's really designed that it gets to a point where it stops, the tension gets released, and then it gets pulled back onto another winch. And it sort of collapses around itself, and really you're trying to reduce the amount of drag. So you've got one side being pulled away from the power plant, and the other line being pulled in. And it's a two-line system, so the line that pulls it in is a different line to the line that drags away. And they kind of seesaw backwards and forwards, and these lines are probably about 1 kilometre long, and it's a series of these drogues that get dragged out, and they effectively follow the flow of the current. And I looked at sort of, could we set this up underwater? Is it necessary to set it up underwater? The only reason why you'd set it up underneath the water is just from an aesthetic point of view, primarily. People are a little bit precious around Portsea and Queenscliff as to the view across that waterway there. And there's all sorts of different design parameters. You've got an incoming tide, you've got an outgoing tide. But the crux of it is that the tide is there 4 times a day, guaranteed. So unlike solar, unlike wind power, the tidal flow is guaranteed 4 times a day. And of course, this relies on being able to store the power into batteries, which is an emerging technology at the moment. So these would be the drogues that are on their way back to the power plant, which floats in the water there. I've got a couple of buoys so that we can see where those lines are. Now, it's not an ideal system. There's loads of potential for these things to get tangled up and caught around each other in the buoys, and there's a whole bunch of boating and stuff that goes on down that neck of the woods. But interestingly, at Port Phillip Heads, there's a very, very deep trench. And inside that trench, there's a huge amount of water that flows in and out, and capturing that flow, that slow-moving flow, and converting it into energy is quite challenging, and particularly quite challenging with systems like turbines. Turbines need a really sort of consistent flow across them. This is very turbulent water down here, whereas a system like the parachutes fill up and get drawn out, and they kind of follow the natural eddies and flows of where the water flows through this it's a 60-meter deep chasm. It's quite amazing, and very, very steep on the sides. And so these get drawn out. As they do, they're spinning that winch, and they come to the end when they suddenly collapse and fold back over themselves, and then get drawn back to the winch as the other half or the other line goes back out. So it's an interesting system. Loads of research has been done on similar sorts of things, but it could be a really good one for Port Phillip Heads because it's a very, very challenging neck of the woods, and the fastest flowing water is somewhere deep inside that trench, not so much at the on the surface. And of course there's marine national parks and all that sort of stuff on either side there. So that was an interesting little exercise looking at how we can harness some of that tidal energy that's available to us at Port Phillip Heads in Victoria.